All right, so I'm Damon. I'm a senior analyst in the drinking water program, and we're going to kind of transition here from presentations about work we've already done or proposals we made in the regulations to where we are on the drinking water side of things, which is we've not yet crafted a regulation. We're here looking for input, so hopefully we're going to have a little more conversation. We handed out through the email system a series of questions we hope you think about, and it includes topics along a broad range of ways that we craft drinking water regulation, looking for opinions, input, concerns you might have about different aspects of drinking water regulations. So, I'm going to just go through a series of slides. Your comments can be in whatever order you'd like them to be, but we thought we'd cover one slide per topic, give people a chance to sort of ruminate on that topic, if you will. I can also answer any questions you might have about the questions. If you're uncertain about what we're trying to get at here and what it might look like in the end of the day, I'm happy to talk about that. But I'll just basically pitch each slide and then look for input from the crowd. So obviously the first question we generally ask is, who should this MCL apply to? As we told you, there are three types of public water systems, and this is the federal model, so we follow it as does every other state. Communities, non-transient non-communities, and transient non-communities. And in general, we gave you examples of what that includes. Your town is a typical community, but it could also be a mobile home park you live in, or an apartment complex, a condominium. These are people live every day and their exposures are greatest. Non-transient non-communities are where the same people come back every day. Best example of that is a school that has its own well, but it's also businesses that have their own well and have more than 25 employees. Transient non-communities are all the other little guys, from the ice cream shops on Cape Cod to places in your communities where you might just stop in for coffee. And then there's also the availability of saying that the applicability could vary based on the size of the public water system. And typically what you see there is more of a staggered approach. The largest guys go first, the next year the next size, the next year the next size. It gives the smallest systems a little more time to figure out how to deal with what might be an immediate large cost event. And you also might vary based on the type of source water they're using to deliver water. Obviously, groundwaters that are underground are a little more protected than a surface water body that might take immediate runoff. So you might have different requirements for a groundwater system versus a surface water system. So with that, I'm going to open it up here on each topic for slides, but feel free to come back to it later if you have a thought later. Jen?
Okay, I have a sort of stepping back question, I hope. We're really trying to understand sort of the legal authority the DEP has to create your own MCL. Could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So as we understand it under, I'll have to look at my attorney in the back of the room, 30A, I believe is the right relevant section of the state statutes. We can promulgate regulations under our general statutes that protect, in very broad terms, sources of drinking water. So that is our authority. All we are required to do is have the kind of public opportunity for comment on regulations, which would then allow us to react to that public comment.
In this slide, is MCL referring to Massachusetts?
Massachusetts.
Okay,
yeah.
just want to be sure.
It's a slight distinction we make where there's not a federal parallel.
Okay.
And perchlorate is probably the best example. There's a Massachusetts MCL for perchlorate and currently no federal perchlorate MCL. Other concerns, questions? Steve?
How does this all fit in with the drinking water guidelines, which, from a practical perspective, have been treated as if they were immediately effective MCLs, but here, when we get to a regulation, we're talking about staggering?
Sure. So staggering is simply an option that we have. It's something the federal government has done as well, where you've got something that might involve significant capital investment necessary. So you give the smaller systems a little more time to figure out the financing. As it goes to how we use guidelines in Massachusetts, the current drinking water regulations already have authority for us to do on a case-by-case basis what's called an individualized health assessment. So we rely on the science that's done by the Office of Research and Standards to kind of have a starting point to know where should we be concerned to put that particular public water system into a health assessment. And so that's where our current authority can use a guideline that's not yet a promulgated standard, but it's on a one system at a time basis. Yes.
Are there situations in the state of Massachusetts where transient non-community water supplies are required to test?
Yeah, they're required for the least amount of things because of their exposure.
Right.
But they do all the acute contaminants, so they do bacterial contamination, nitrate, nitrites, sodium, and we make them do fluoride testing as well. If they were to use a certain treatment practice that has a potential acute byproduct, chlorine dioxide, they'd be subject to that part of the regulations as well.
And the transient non-community, that's daycare centers and community centers, right?
So it depends. So it's based upon how many people are served on an everyday basis. If the same people come back and those same people are 25 or more, they're actually a non-transient. You have to think about this as places that have essentially like fewer than 25 employees, and the belief is different people come every day. So daycare center has 25 or more kids coming every day, they're not a transient non-community. Same thing with the community center, depending on like the staffing levels.
Okay, so where anything under 25 that you're not expected every single day, even if, what if there are 25 and they're different, that's transient?
So that makes them a public water system, 25 people a day, 60 days a year, but it's different people, they're typically gonna be a transient non-community system.
Okay.
Other questions or concerns on applicability? Okay, and again, you can come back to it if it hits you later.
And also, in addition to coming back during today's conversation, you guys have all the questions, they're gonna be here on the, posted on the slides. And the idea is that we have an extended window for sort of pre-rulemaking input. So loop back with us through that drinking water email at the last slide and give us your thoughts on these or further questions about, clarification on any of these.
And remember what Stephanie said, eventually we're gonna propose a drinking water regulation. And if you see a proposal that either you are concerned about or you feel it's not protective enough or not applicable enough, you can comment during that regulatory process as well. So this isn't the end of the game here. Steve, and then.
Sure. To Jen's question, you referenced a law and you said one of the only things you need to do is have a public comment period.
So Chapter 30A is basically the Administrative Procedures Act,
Yep.
and that tells the executive branch agencies how we promulgate regulations.
So my question is, are there any parallels to the EPA MCL process, looking at
So
costs
no,
and
the
technologies? Or
EPA MCL process is actually in the Safe Drinking Water Act
Right.
statute.
Right.
So Congress told EPA, you shall follow these procedures.
Right.
The legislature in Massachusetts told us under 30A, you shall follow these procedures.
Which is
And
just
so
the one?
It's different.
Okay.
I don't want to say it's the only obligation in 30A. What I'm saying is that when we've been asked the question about, do you have to do a formal cost-benefit analysis, do you have to promulgate an MCLG, we were not held to those requirements.
Right.
I just want to call attention to the fact that I know that the question of waivers for smaller water systems and different standards has a lot to do with the cost and affordability. And so I'm asking the question about what mechanisms, if any, DEP has at your disposal to encourage state action when it comes to going after polluters to cover the cost of cleanup, especially for those smaller water systems.
Sure. So some of that's under a lock shop, so not under the drinking water program, but we do work closely with the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup. We typically will do, in conjunction with their staff, a site discovery type activity it's called, to figure out where is the contamination coming from. You try to then identify a potentially responsible party, if I have that acronym correct. Yep, thumbs up, good. In which case then, those kind of cost recovery activities would take place under the Waste Site Cleanup program. Once you find a responsible individual or organization or entity, whatever you want to call it, they would potentially be on the hook for doing cleanup activities. And potentially also putting in a remedy that covers the drinking water source that's been impacted. We do see that across the state in this contamination and other ones. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Do you see a need for a legislative effort to get some money allocated to the DEP for those smaller water systems that cannot afford the testing? Or is there a mechanism by which funding can be brought to the smaller water supplies before, obviously the CERCLA process is a long and winding road.
Right.
And people drinking poison should know as soon as possible. So is there something that we can help do to provide funding for the testing of smaller communities?
So I can't speak for the legislature. You know, they have the ability to put forth bills that can cover any kind of support they feel is appropriate. What I can talk about is historic practices that we're aware of. The biggest mechanism that we have to provide support for all public water systems is probably the state revolving fund. This is actually federal funding that comes into every state that's then allowed to use for treatment typically, and those kind of activities, rather than the standard monitoring and the kind of things we're just starting to talk about here. So we typically don't see federal mechanisms to support routine activities like testing your water. That's not to say it isn't on the agenda for them to think about. I mean, there's a lot of bills for PFAS that are going on in both Congress, a lot of stuff being discussed in state legislatures as well, so I'm not going to try to predict what they might authorize to be expended. But certainly that's one thing we'd like to hear. You know, we don't do a formal cost-benefit analysis, but understanding the cost to especially smaller public water systems is something we try to take into consideration. It's one of the reasons we look at applicability. You know, if we were to tell, if we were understanding that the science tells us that maybe exposure at a transient non-community isn't as concerning as exposure in a community setting, maybe we just take them out of the regulation completely. We still wouldn't necessarily we wouldn't test at a public water system to TNC. Sorry, I'm trying to use acronyms. At a transient non-community system, but we wouldn't do it routinely. And we would do it probably more on the site discovery type thing, where they're in an area known to be contaminated, and we pick up sampling there. You know, so this gets into, we started getting into the monitoring questions a little bit. To frame it, you know, we don't have to allow monitoring waivers. What we typically do in offering a monitoring waiver is take into consideration areas of the Commonwealth that simply have demonstrated no contamination. Historical test results show there's no contamination, and the sources are protected against activities which may contribute that contamination. And so that then becomes a cost saving for systems in those types of areas by reducing the monitoring requirements or potentially eliminating them in some of our waiver programs. These are typically renewable grants, so we do it, not a grant in terms of money, but a grant of a waiver is typically reviewed every 3 years. So we're looking at a situation in case land use has changed, in case a new industry comes into play, in case we haven't been some reduced testing during that 3 years and it shows detections, they'll lose their waiver. And so then now they're back on the normal monitoring program. Okay?
I know this can be a very emotional issue for some folks, some groups, but words do matter, and so I would just like to ask that we not use poison necessarily in this and talk about contaminants, because I think, you know, words can be sort of inflammatory, and the public is watching. It is a contaminant of concern. Let's just use it as that word and not poison, please.
Yes.
I guess I'm still stuck on the question of background, because if there really hasn't been, correct me if I'm wrong, has there been, you know, a pretty good look at levels in groundwater in areas that you wouldn't expect, you know, based on land use, like this, I think Mark said, maybe more private wells are gonna have an issue because they're near septic systems. There's plenty of public, you know, community systems near septic systems.
Yeah,
And
so
I think you're gonna find
I can take you
that-
pieces if you want. Go ahead.
Well, let me just say, I feel like your map that you showed in the very
Right.
beginning with just a few red and orange dots, you know, it's going to turn red all over the state. And even the larger or medium-sized community systems are going to have a very difficult time with the cost, bill treatment quickly, and pass that cost on to the ratepayers. So, you know, it's just moving very fast and be difficult for systems of all sizes and stuff.
Yeah, so just to recap, how are we understanding background now and how many systems do we anticipate would have an effect if we were promulgating this MCL? To date, the only really closest statewide monitoring effort is the UCMR3. Only 171 public water systems in Massachusetts were actually required to test under UCMR3 for PFAS. Most of them are in the eastern part of the state because it's population-based requirements. You have to serve over 10,000 people to be required to sample under UCMR3. EPA then picks 800 small guys nationally, and we have about a dozen in Massachusetts that were also included in UCMR3 sampling. It's one of the reasons why we've been, we're asked, and we did now send this letter out, suggesting voluntary testing. To help us understand, while we're in this process, how many more hotspots or contaminated areas you might find. The other concern is UCMR3 had less sensitive methods of testing. You know, depending on your combination of the PFAS that were in their UCMR3 monitoring, I think we figured out you could have as much as like 130 parts per trillion. So you have to have the exact combination of those 6 to get that high. So you could have had easily 20 or 30 of, I think it's PFOA was at 40, PFAS was at 30 or 20, somewhere in that range. So the numbers we're talking about now, especially with the MCP proposal, even our ORSG, aren't necessarily supported by UCMR monitoring. But this is also what we're talking about 6 years ago. So analytical techniques, laboratories' confidence in running these methods have gotten better. That's why we're hoping to do more monitoring as this process evolves. You know, we're asking the UCMR3 PWSs to go back to their labs because we've been told by some of the UCMR3 labs they actually ran them at a more sensitive level, and that data is available. We're hoping that can be captured as part of this effort. We're hoping more systems will do voluntary testing at today's sensitivity so we get a better sense of how many systems might be affected. But you're right, we really won't know until we do more comprehensive statewide testing, especially west of the Connecticut River. Not a lot of public water systems out there serve over 10,000, so they weren't part of UCMR3 monitoring. So we don't have a good sense of hotspots in that portion of the state.
And I'll just also add, everything Damon said is right on. And also, we are actively looking into what other states have done for broader sampling. So there are some states who have done more proactive sampling at a broader range of public water systems. So it's not Massachusetts, but it starts to paint a little bit of a picture about what is the background level in other states. So we're gathering that information now. If there's anything that anybody has got to share with us, that's certainly part of our considerations here. So New Hampshire has done pretty broad sampling, and I think Michigan, and we're in the process of gathering the information about who was sampled, for what compounds, at what reporting limits, and what were their findings. So we are trying to gather that just as an indicator of what some of the neighboring states are finding, beyond the UCMR3 data.
And it gives you a little bit better picture. I mean, Michigan did every single community public water system in the state. They published that on their webpage. They're doing all the NTNCs this year, so they're starting to get to the smaller guys. In that first round, they included schools because the school had its own well. They were concerned about exposing a crowded population. So it's a surrogate of a statewide measure. It's not the best one yet because we haven't tested every public water system in Mass. But you know, we're going to talk a little bit later that we still hope to do some targeted sampling in areas that weren't well covered by UCMR3 and maybe we're close to other known PFAS contaminations, but we haven't yet started that yet. But
when we're talking about background, it's great we're testing the PWS and private wells and things like that. But when I think about background, I'm looking at places that you're going to see what is the relevant existing PFOA, PFAS, rivers and streams that aren't near anything, or soil sites and things like that. That's going to give you the determination of what your background is. Is there any studies on that, like that? Would DEP thinking about doing something like that so we can determine what actually is out there and then compare that to what's in water?
yeah, so I think Mark mentioned that the Vermont soil study is probably the best one we've heard about in terms of looking at what is the quote-unquote background level that's out there in the environment right now. I don't think we've seen some statements from some of these states that have done the broad-scale monitoring to get a sense of, well, there's not an immediately proximate contamination source, yet they're still seeing X amount. So either due through airborne deposition, traveling down through riverways and streams and such, you might get transport of contamination from a site that's not obvious to the we have at least one site, one of the public water systems we're tracking where we really don't have an obvious source of contamination yet. And the levels are not just at the 2 or 3 parts per trillion level. I think the last raw value I saw was in the 40s. So something's there, but we haven't found it yet. That's sort of a combination of waste site cleanup activities, the public water system themselves is looking around in the community, and getting a sense of how broadly these contaminants might spread through municipal waste handling or anything else that just spreads the common use of these chemicals around.
The other question I had is, are you going to restrict analytical to 537.1, or are you going to allow 537 modified?
So not 537 modified yet. We're sticking to the 2 published versions of 537 and 537.1.
Okay.
But we're looking for comments. Isotope dilution is being commonly used now to modify 537. I think EPA has hinted that they're close to actually publishing that as a new version, so obviously we would accept that. Our general practice is to accept EPA published methods or methods published by other method development organizations. But that individual modifications that are not within the scope of the method, because this is where it gets a little complicated. The method allows you to modify some parts of the process, but not others. Modifying the parts you can't modify are things that we really can't be comfortable with, because we don't have the horsepower to do inter-laboratory comparisons to say, oh yes, that modification doesn't alter the quantification or what you're finding. You know, that's really, we have to rely on the methods development organizations to do that.
One last, on certified labs, they are required to do,
Performance testing?
thank you.
Yes. So we don't currently certify in Massachusetts. That regulation package you'll see is moving forward. What we're doing is, under the drinking water program, we actually have the authority to tell a laboratory you can or can't do work in Massachusetts. So that's the 6 laboratories we've approved to do work in Massachusetts. They're all certified by other agencies. In almost every case, it's another state, or it's a state acting under the National Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program.
Yep.
So they've certified labs to do work across the country or in their state. And what we've done is we've accepted that certification to do work in Massachusetts. As we develop our own certifications and roll that out, we would then be more directly involved with our lab certification staff, looking at their performance tests, looking at their SOPs, looking at how they actually run the method to ensure that we're as confident as the other state was who certified them. But yes, PTs are part of the requirement whenever we have a certification program. Yes?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, pretty much related to each other. One is cleanup of site. In the community that I live in, there's a large site that needs to get cleaned up. It's been estimated, I think, at $300,000 or something. It's an environmental justice community. And then, is there any way to get some funds for that? But also on top of that, how do you actually physically do that? I mean, it's a pretty large piece of area. And are there places for that to go to then? And
So,
Does-
it's outside of drinking water, so I'm gonna be a little bit out of my
Oh, I'm
comfort
sorry.
zone, but that's okay, I'll try.
Well, we're doing it to protect our drinking water.
Yes, absolutely. That's where my knowledge of these programs are there. So, under a waste site cleanup program or under a federal Superfund site, because we do have a couple Superfund activities going on right now. Either the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, that's the MCP,
Yeah.
or EPA under CERCLA will do an activity to clean up. And you heard Paul generally describe that process. CERCLA is very similar. They assess the site, they propose a remedy, and remedies can be things like removal of soil. They can
Yeah.
be pump and treat systems, which actually dry out the contaminated water, treat it, and then they discharge clean water back into the aquifer. So those are the two I'm mostly familiar with.
Yeah.
In terms of getting rid of the waste from that, you know, we've looked into this question a little bit in drinking water, because we've been asked, well, where do I put the carbon that we're using in my filter right now?
Yeah.
And we don't have a real solid answer on that yet. You know, whether or not carbon regeneration systems, which heat up carbon to a high temperature to basically destroy the stuff that's stuck to it, if that's sufficiently robust to destroy PFAS, I can't answer right now. In terms of soil removal, I mean, my guess would be it goes to a place that doesn't allow, you know, any leaching through it, so this would be a hazardous waste landfill or something similar. I'm guessing on that one.
I think they did have a hot spot and they brought some of it to Taunton or something, but what I'm hearing is that that's really limited. That was like that, you know.
Yeah,
Went
I
there
think
2 years ago.
Where you're looking
They
at.
don't want any more.
Right, when you're looking at a mobile set of compounds like PFAS that are gonna leach into the groundwater, a pump and treat system is probably what you're looking at. You
Yeah.
develop intercepting wells, so groundwater flows underground in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And so you take capture wells that are at the edge of that plume, and you pump out the groundwater, treat it, and then return the clean water back to the aquifer. So that's kind of the idea behind it.
They are doing pump and treat there.
Right.
Also, as part of the process.
You also want to deal with the pollution prevention aspect. So you want to
Yeah.
deal with the activity that's actually introducing. Paul mentioned that in his talk as well. You're looking to avoid the ongoing addition of more PFAS into the environment.
Yeah, we're getting polluted by another thing, and in some weeks on a Friday they'll say, oh, we're gonna work together, and then like 2 weeks later it isn't. That is sort of, it seems to be clearing up at this point. I hope it does.
Yep.
Because that's exactly what's needed, is the work in
Right.
between. And the one last thing I was gonna ask for is, are there other things like PFASs and other things that are on the horizon that might be like the next thing to?
So one of my contributions to an earlier question about how do we keep track of this kind of stuff?
Yeah.
A number of us participate in multi-state and federal work groups on emerging contaminants. I participate in them. I know Paul does. I know Mark does. So between the dozens of us at MassDEP participate in these efforts, we tend to hear about and then start tracking other chemicals of concern. The drinking water process to actually regulate contaminants that was developed in the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act allows for everything that, from like citizen nomination of concerns to industry usage. So in other words, volume of chemical being produced in the US will trigger its look during the Safe Drinking Water Act reviews. So there's a number of different avenues whereby chemicals can be nominated for concern. But we also look to the research industries, the academic industries that are looking at, is there a health effect from this latest thing? Because everyone's using it in their cologne or something of that nature. So that's where 1,4-dioxane started getting interested in. MassDEP does have an emerging contaminants work group internally so that we do cross-bureau. So air and water and waste all talk together to say, what are you looking at? What are you seeing out of municipal landfills? What are you seeing in the drinking water programs, especially in the unregulated monitoring efforts? So those are the sort of standing activities that exist and keep us in the loop.
And one example, if you look at the current rollout of the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, and those substances that EPA is looking nationwide for frequency prevalence of those. So, for instance, there's a number of the cyanotoxins that come from hazardous algae blooms.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of public opportunities, EPA has a UCMR 5 webinar in about 3 weeks, I think. I have the date in my pocket, but it's on my emails. So, if you're interested, Google that. EPA, it's a publicly available meeting. It goes like all day. And I think it's just their opportunity to say, what is the concern to the public or other stakeholders that they want to consider putting into UCMR 5. So we talked a little about monitoring, but
So to get to your question, or
No.
answer your question.
It need not be answered now.
I mean, I think from the water supplier's perspective, there should be monitoring waivers and, the ability to reduce monitoring requirements, because I think, these are not inexpensive tests.
Really not. I mean, our estimate is about $500 per site that you want to test, and that's just one round.
One round, right. So.
Yeah, so I mean, and that plays a role in this. And the real thing we've learned over I've been here for 25 years. Monitoring waivers program can be very effective in screening out public water systems that should be monitoring at a more increased frequency and those where it's really not necessary because of more pristine sources, more robust source protection, no historical land uses or activities that have contaminated their supplies. And so we're able to really make these targeted regulations by offering things like monitoring waivers. Yeah.
If that ends up being your process, one thing I just want to flag is because of the prevalence of PFAS in different materials like food packaging, like I've heard of a lot of cases of commercial composting businesses where you're taking PFAS coated food packaging, turning it into compost and transporting that all across the state. So I would just hope that as you determine where those waivers are appropriate, you're thinking about just the sheer magnitude of the prevalence
Absolutely.
of PFAS
And that's the kind of
products.
thing we do take into consideration. In fact, even the existing monitoring waivers for the various compounds that we allow waivers now, the outcome of the waiver is different. Like for volatile organics, very common in commerce, dry cleaning fluids, think of those kind of things, gasoline products. We don't allow you to eliminate monitoring for VOCs. We allow you to reduce it. Things like pesticides that are used on pineapples, we allow you to reduce that monitoring to almost zero because it's really not something you grow in Massachusetts. So that's how we sort of take into account prevalence and commercial use in Massachusetts specifically. Okay, I got a few more of these, so we'll just keep changing them, but again, you can take back. So the analytical question, you've heard it in the mass contingency plan is asking for input on this. We are also going to be asking for input on this. We've heard a little bit of questions already starting to come into play here. Ultimately, when we pass a drinking water regulation, you need to have a reliable test method that enough laboratories can use, so the public water systems that we're requiring to test can do the testing at these laboratories. And so ultimately, what we're looking at here is how we structure the requirement. Is 20 parts per trillion really supportable with the existing methods and labs and the uncertainties in the analytical process? So that's where some of these questions are coming from. We're also making sure, if anyone else has heard of new methods that are coming, I did mention that we were told EPA is supposed to publish a new method this summer. They said July, but we'll see. But that's really targeting additional small chain substitutes for the legacy long chain compounds. But again, in the concern about these are PFASs that are in the environment, that kind of methodology might also be useful for us to get a sense of continuing contamination. So questions, input on the analytical world? Steve?
So, it's the same concern we had when we first rolled out perchlorate rule, where if we're thinking about 20 for 6, at these detection levels we're awfully close. Typically, we like to see a bit more space so we have fewer false positives.
So
We'll need to think a bit about, we need to be clear that we're thinking about confirmatory monitoring and how information rolls out, so that we provide the public clear information about real results and not things which are so close to the edge that we're not sure we're really seeing what we think we're seeing.
Right. So give people a sense of what we're talking about here. A method can measure down to the signal-noise ratio. And once you get too close to that, which is the reporting limit, it gets unclear about what your quantity is in that result. Doesn't mean it's a bad test, it just means that you're right in the analytical limit of what you're able to measure. And so with 20 parts per trillion, laboratories right now measuring PFAS for us are measuring at about 2 to 3 parts per trillion limit. So you multiply that by 6 and you're at 12 to 18. So you're so close to what we're potentially going to introduce as a standard that there's uncertainty, and once you add them all together, that's really close to the limit where we're going to say you're in violation. So that's where we have to sort of get a look at what we call analytical feasibility. Is it really feasible to measure reliably the difference between a non-detect and a detect and say you've now violated a standard based upon this measurement?
Do we know the difference between the limit of detection and the limit of quantitation for each of the 6?
Yeah, they're almost all the same. What we're seeing is, the analytical practices, the reporting limit is actually the limit of quantitation.
Okay.
So 2 to 3 is where the laboratory says they're confidently able to quantify what they're seeing. What we're also getting though is laboratories are reporting to us, it's there, but we can't quantify it.
Right.
So you get this kind of like a blip on your radar. And how we deal with those blips is something that we have to figure out if we're going to stay at this low level.
Do you have, sorry, just
Yeah,
on that,
please,
do you
go
have,
ahead.
do you have any thoughts yet on how you handle that?
So, we're getting data now, obviously. In the clear-cut cases where we're getting detections above a minimum reporting level, it's straightforward. We're using those to sum up the 5, compare against the ORSG on a site-by-site basis. My own thoughts on detections that are there but not quantifiable is we deal with black and white numbers in the drinking water program in terms of noncompliance with the numeric standard. So it's a little hard to take that uncertainty into that certain outcome. So we might think about using it for other purposes. Like you're getting a real detect, so maybe we keep them on increased monitoring. But these are all just my thoughts. We're not writing regulations yet, but we're looking for input on if you have thoughts about how we might use the less than MRL, but it's there but not quantifiable. Yes?
Do these methods take precursors into account, or
So
not at all?
the 2 methods right now for drinking water just have the 14 PFASs and the 18 PFASs. I don't believe any of these are the telomers and those kind of things that are precursors. 537.1 added some of the Gen X compounds and I think maybe another one of the little short chain ones. The new method we're told is coming out is taking a lot more of the smaller PFAS compounds into play, but I haven't seen yet a published drinking water method that takes into consideration of precursors. Doesn't mean people aren't measuring them. It's just not necessarily standardized practice yet. Okay. save the time's getting too long. So compliance and treatment, obviously once we've done some applicability and done some testing, we have to know whether or not you're in compliance with the maximum contaminant level or not. We also have to know about what types of treatment we might require you to put in place or is available to put in place. So we're looking for input on technologies that are out there. You know, this is again part of the opportunity for you to keep us in the loop on stuff that you might be aware of that we're not. To introduce the first bullet a little bit more, you know, we talked about this briefly in the April 11th meeting. You know, we're kind of landing on calling PFAS a subchronic contaminant, so we're not talking about 1 day exposure causing an adverse health effect, but we're also not talking about 70 years causing an adverse health effect. And so how you determine non-compliance with the numeric standard is probably going to be different than the two obvious examples we have now in the regulations. You know, today, if you have an acute contaminant, one sample with confirmation, you're out of compliance. If you have a chronic contaminant, it's usually a running annual average, so you take a year's worth of monitoring, 4 quarters, you average them together, and you figure that against the numeric standard. In this case, we're probably looking at a shorter time exposure of concern, so we'd probably be looking to craft something else. Maybe a monthly running annual average, but maybe not on an annual basis, maybe on a quarterly basis. So, you know, we're gonna have to probably play with the little ideas, put it out for public comment, ultimately in the regulation, and make sure it's understandable to both the regulated community and the public.
And you have some trade-off on cost.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we make a determination that a public water system is out of compliance with an MCL, they have to take a remedy. Now, that could be taking a well offline, but it could also be having to install treatment, which now is incurring a cost.
I'm just thinking monitoring. If you're talking
Monitoring,
about
yeah.
monthly,
Yeah.
if you're talking about averaging months,
Right.
you're now talking about a lot more samples per year.
Yeah, you can't do that if you don't put people on monthly, so I don't mean to propose anything at this point. I'm just suggesting that you would do a different calculation.
You looking at just doing testing on the finished water or
Yeah,
raw?
so MCL compliance is based on public exposure. So this is entry point sampling of what's being delivered to the public. It doesn't mean wouldn't necessarily require public water systems to take additional samples. That's part of the site discovery activities we try to get into to help them understand the source of their contamination. And again, you're welcome to send stuff in at another time. You know, we're definitely interested in technologies that you've heard are successfully being applied in other parts of the country. We don't have a lot of unique examples in Massachusetts of treatment that's being put on place. You know, carbon is the most common. There's some resins being discussed. There's some small scale under-the-counter reverse osmosis that's available. Whether or not that's really applicable to a large public water system doing it kind of depends. You've got a pretty concentrated waste stream on a reverse osmosis system, so you probably have a waste problem at that point. But those are the kind of questions we need to explore with any technology that's suggested for what's called the best available technology. Okay.
Given that you're seeing cases where certain PFAS compounds with technically fewer carbons actually have a longer half-life, are you going to be paying more attention to, because my understanding is most treatment technologies spend a lot of time focusing on filtering out long-chain PFAS, and so are you going to be paying more attention to quote-unquote shorter-chain PFAS, given that they might actually have, in some cases, a longer half-life?
Yeah, I mean, in the drinking water program, we start with the science that comes from the Office of Research and Standards. So, as you heard, moving towards PFBS, which is the 4-carbon version, is next on the list. So, as we either adapt the MCL, or if that work were to complete before we complete our process, the MCL could be either a separate MCL for short chain, or short chain. So, I'm not ruling out anything. What we're really looking at right now is likely to be a similar proposal than with the MCP. So you get the 6 long chain legacy compounds. The substitutions that are short chain compounds, and even some of the older short chain compounds, we don't yet have enough toxicology data to say, oh, we should regulate, and this is how we should build that regulation.
So,
Steve?
I was at a meeting recently and someone raised a question for another state about whether they were thinking about like the larger environmental trade-offs around greenhouse gas production, about using more carbon, having to regenerate, particularly when we're down at these single-digit nanograms where you're going to have to regenerate a lot in many wells because you're going to be capturing a lot of other contaminants. Is that part of the DEP process, or is it part of the EEA process?
It's
That's part of our larger goals.
Right. It's certainly something that we are open to receiving during the public comment process. I mean, as Paul said, very detailed comments like that are great during the regulatory process comment, because then we can say, oh, in fact, EDA and the department are very interested in climate goals, so are we actually creating something that's gonna cause a balancing act that has to be performed?
So I'm happy to, switch to using persistent bioaccumulative toxic carcinogens, but that's really long. But I'm happy to do that if that's what I need to do. I am concerned that this compliance and treatment does not include the mention of using an alternative PFAS-free water supply if it's available. And the reason I bring this up is that we are an AFFF contaminated community, both through the National Guard, which is a state agency, technically speaking, and through our own city, which, yay. But the thing about it is that the foam that we received from DEP, that they identified as coming from Joint Base Cape Cod, when UMass took a look at it, had over 300 different PFAS in it. And so while I'd really love to be non-detect for 6, I'm worried about the other 290 something.
Sure.
And I am wondering whether or not there is a way in this compliance and treatment and the whole treatment train. I'm wondering if not giving us PFAS water could be number 1 on the list.
So absolutely, there's nothing that says in the drinking water regulations you have to install treatment on your existing source. Having an alternative source, whether that means purchasing from a regional system, a neighboring system, or drilling new wells or identifying new reservoirs, is always an option. When we sit down with a public water system that's in non-compliance with an MCL, we don't say, so what's your treatment option? We say, what are you considering to deliver water that meets our standards? And so it's a performance requirement. They have to do something, like a remedy solution in waste site cleanup, to deliver to the public water that meets the standards. Now that could be pristine new source. There aren't a lot of communities that have the ability to find that pristine new source in their town boundaries. So, they could look to regionalization, they could look to neighboring purchases, they could look at different things. Oftentimes, treatment is usually the lowest cost, easiest way to do that right off the bat.
Right, well, my point is that since the treatment that our city has chosen does not address those other hundreds of compounds,
Right.
And we can't monitor for them at this point.
Right.
Is there an option to make the preferential, if it's available, the elimination of PFAS in our public water supply?
What we're doing is we're seeking input, pre-rule making input on what
Right.
the rule could look like.
It
And
can look
that,
like
and
that?
that is input that's very useful. Like, could we consider, I don't think there's precedent for it in our drinking water program now, but there's PFAS is different with this large group of family that we know very little about.
Right.
And some presumptions that could be made about they travel together, and also some information that indicates that treatment itself can result in other compounds, certainly passing through, but also maybe being generated. So I hear you that this is a suggestion about could the rule be structured that way to actually have preference for the remedy.
Yeah.
And the preference being find an alternate source.
Yeah.
So whether statutorily we're prohibited from that, or I would go to Damon, but
Yeah, I
but
don't-
I hear you that that's a suggestion.
Yeah, and I shouldn't have dove in too much on a remedy, because, obviously, we're looking for input here, so if the input is, we would like to see the rule consider the possibility of, because of the broad range of what might be in the water, not only focusing on the 6 that may be in the proposed MCL, but rather, let's look at an alternate source.
But I just don't understand, sorry to chime in, but, what does it mean to have PFAS-free water? How do we even know, how would we ever know that?
Well, basically, you're limited by analytical technology.
Right.
So all you can say is that, at this point, in addition to the 6 that we might regulate, you've got 12 more in method 537.1.
But,
So you
which
could
is, we
have-
know, scratching the surface potentially.
Absolutely, yeah, so I'm only up to 18. I'm nowhere near 3,000, 5,000, whatever it might be. This is by no means to say we have certainty here.
I just don't wanna chase the phantom,
like.
I'm just thinking out loud
Right.
about, I think you're right. And
Well,
then I'm also thinking like, what is the
And I
way to
think-
propose, what is the way for us to chime in as advocates to
Right.
ask for something that's doable and
Well, and I think
meaningful?
there's an opportunity later to comment in this meeting today on the treatment technology for the class of PFAS. you know, we know that was the petition, we made a decision not to go that route, but we're still open to getting input on a class type regulation, which would be more broadly spoken, you know, outside of what you can measure.
And what you're referring to is a petition that was filed by
Treatment
CLF
Center,
and
sorry.
Toxic Action Center,
Yeah.
to have it be a class of much
Right.
broader than just the
Yeah, Doug will
6.
introduce that after this section, so we'll get into a little more detail of what the petition was and what our decision was, and then how we're still looking for input on that.
And I guess I would say, you know, given the available analytical methods to go with an approach like what Kristen was talking about, it'd be a preference as a remedy. It would be a preference for a raw water, for source water that had no detection of any of those that are in the existing method 537, 537-1. So you wouldn't be guaranteed PFAS free because we don't have testing methodologies for the 3,000 plus. But we do have certified, approved methodologies for the, how many are in 537, 537-1?
14 and 18.
14 and 18. So so that could be the way the rule could be structured, is my point.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's nothing that says, as more analytical processes come out, that kind of a structure could be built in to say, you know, as capability expands, so does the rules concern. But like Doug said, there's not a lot of precedence for that in the existing Safe Drinking Water Act-based rules, but doesn't mean we can't think about that. Is there a question about?
I just wanted to make a comment. There shouldn't be left an impression that all these other PFAS compounds automatically pass through carbon. There are
Right.
data sets being built across the Commonwealth that show, at least we're monitoring for 23 and typically see 13 or 14, and they're all non-detected.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something we want to make sure is part of this discussion and part of the conversation as we craft the rule, is that, you know, it's not a given that certain PFASs do go through carbon and certain PFASs do not, so it's a very useful comment. Yes?
I guess I just want to make a comment. I mean, worked with public water systems in Mass for 25 years, and it's very rare that a system is going to have an alternate source
Right.
that's pristine and they can just switch it on. If they did, they would have already had it on. You know, to get a new source developed, tested, permitted, built, 10 years, easy.
Yeah, and you know, I did hope I would get that point across when we were discussing this, but yeah, it's not easy to put a new source in, especially within the boundaries of your town. And you don't know what you're gonna get until you drill a test well and you start looking at the
Or
water
even
quality there.
regionalization or connecting, to an MWRA, it's very expensive, takes a lot of time, and people need to understand the complexities in that.
So the last slide on this sort of topics was notification and costs. And we've touched on costs on and off, but the last piece of a regular rule will be notification triggers. Typically, you've got notifications both to MassDEP and to the public, and they may or may not always be in the same triggers. So we're also open to conversations about, how much do you want a public water system to let the public know versus let the public know, or any other types of intermediary kind of triggers. Just to put it in some context, the Consumer Conference Report rule doesn't change this regulation, so any detections of regulated contaminants are always going to be in the annual report. So that wouldn't change as we add new MCLs. You'd still get that kind of notification. If they violate an MCL, there's almost always a public notification trigger for that, so you get public notification for violating an MCL. But we're open to conversations about other notification requirements that would be important to the community. And then costs, I just put in all the other topics under this, so if there's anything we didn't cover under costs that you'd like to discuss now, either on the cost of monitoring, the cost of compliance, the cost of treatments, or anything else of that nature. Yes?
I think, building upon your comments about water supply here, I don't have a firm sense that we have our arms around the scope of the problem in Massachusetts. 351 towns, groundwater primarily the supply. And I'm wondering what DEP and the state is doing in terms of studies of background, because the scope of the problem is going to inform solutions and regulation. Now, we don't have a requirement for a regulatory impact analysis, but we need to know what the scope of the problem is, so water suppliers have a sense, can we go for alternative supply, or do we really have a background issue here that is, everybody's gonna have to wrestle with? And I think of the small towns in the Berkshires that are located on sandy deposits in bedrock valleys that are vulnerable. So I guess my question to DEP is, what sorts of vulnerability assessments are you doing using land use studies, Mass GIS and so forth?
Yeah, so there's a
And
little bit
then
of that.
just random testing
Right.
of groundwater. It doesn't have to be a public supply or a private, it's just random testing across the state to look at the scope.
So, I'll start with randomization then. The voluntary testing requirement is probably the closest we're gonna get to randomized testing. Potentially, some of the labs will be able to provide UCMR3 data back to a public water system that asks for it, to get a little more sensitivity down to get better measurements. The first map, which will be on our webpage tomorrow, I think, you'll see all the UCMR3 participants. So coverage is, obviously I said worse west of the Connecticut River, but it's pretty good in the rest of the Commonwealth. We're getting some testing through just voluntary efforts before that letter went out, and, the public water systems are sharing with us. The wayside cleanup program, when they go into an area that has private wells, we'll be testing those resources as well. So we're getting, not a municipal or large public water system type measurement, but we're getting potentially a shallow, vulnerable private well. We have a targeted public water system testing proposal that's still working its way through discussions here at MassDEP. There's a bullet point coming up on that.
Okay.
But it's a little bit more along the lines of trying to trace back to hotspots still. We're not really proposing anything yet where we would go out or we'd ask systems to just randomly test in areas where we don't think that there's a concern. The idea and the understanding behind the sources of PFAS is still evolving. One of the reasons we participate in these multi-state efforts is because other states are doing targeted sampling and then telling us where they found the source of contamination. So we're sharing that information internally here to look at things like, Rhode Island's sweep through their state, not this year, but last year, found a fire department contaminated its own well from AFFF. So just handling that material basically drained out to the street. New Hampshire's doing an extensive amount of sort of targeted sampling of different things. Vermont's doing some targeted sampling. That's where we came up with some of this understanding about the cleaning products being used in schools, that green stuff that Janet already pushed around. That could be a contributing source to their own septic system and thereby to their own drinking water source. So as those understandings of land uses that are contributing PFAS to the environment continues to grow, so does our look at places where we think it might happen. One of the reasons why we decided to make every new source test for PFAS in the Commonwealth is exactly that question. We don't know what might be the land use to say, this is gonna be a PFAS source, this is not. And so to help us evolve that, we're testing these almost random, it's not a high volume amount of testing. It's probably been a dozen new sources this year.
Yeah, it's the dry wells in communities that don't have collection systems that I'm concerned with. Car washes, other septic systems, just the scope of the problem in those areas, and people may be on small supplies or their own supply, but
we've done some GIS analysis based upon the known sources so far, and that's how we've actually developed some of the targeting we wanted to do in the Commonwealth.
Maybe a consideration might be to talk to DCR and USGS about their groundwater well monitoring network, and as an option for looking at background, take some tests out of those.
Yeah.
They're supposedly like near natural,
We're actually the staff that does the evaluation of those wells.
you see,
We go out on behalf of USGS and look at water levels.
So it could be an opportunity.
It could be
for
an
you to look
opportunity,
at.
yeah, absolutely.
New England data is great to share because the geology, hydrogeology in New England's very
Right.
similar, right? That's all useful database. But Massachusetts probably has the greatest GDP of all the states, 16 times the size of Vermont in terms of GDP. And we're looking at Vermont studies and others, and I think we need to take some leadership and develop the studies that the others can draw on.
Sure.
And because
No,
we're
that's a good
taking
comment.
leadership and regulation, let's do the background research as well. That's my feeling.
Sure, no, thank you.
The sources that you just talked about when you're gathering information and hearing
Yep.
about things like cleaning products, is that getting shared back to anybody so that the prevention can start?
Yeah, so the multi-state activities, the outcomes of that are being shared with EPA. You know, a lot of times the kind of pollution prevention activities are at the federal level. We've done that in some other emergent contaminant activities as well, where we found evidence of where the contamination came from, and at the federal level, they can work with the manufacturers more easily than we can work from one state perspective, but that's about the amount of sharing that we were able to do at this point.
So you can't sort of issue a, I don't know, through municipal services or someone that could say to, hey, communities, you have a well, be careful of these things? Is that-
Oh, well, we are doing that. So we communicate with all the public water systems, including the small ones that might be using products that, through their own septic systems, are gonna contaminate their own wells. So yes, we are doing some of that type of direct communication with public water systems, including the small ones.
We have another group here at DEP that focuses on waste products and products in general, long history of looking at mercury-containing products, for example. So they are now getting involved in this whole process. I would expect that there would be opportunities and initiatives to try to do what you are suggesting in the near future.
So that's my last slide, but if anything that we went over earlier, you wanna ask another question about before we pass it on? Jen?
Well, I piggybacking on what Kirsten said, you know, I think that given the complexity of managing public water supply these days, you know, there is certainly the MCL process, but the MCL process should also consider the other regulatory issues that are impacting water systems, like Water Management Act and constraints on withdrawing from certain supplies because of, you know, Water Management Act permit conditions, or, you know, Interbasin Transfer Act regulations if you're looking at a regionalization option. To understand the full scope, you kind of need to look at all of the regulatory pieces that
Yeah,
impact
absolutely.
water supply.
Anything else? All right, I'll pass it over to Doug.